Welcome to the Haunted Brew. Grab your favorite blend of coffee or tea and pull up a comfy chair for some unexplainable and unsettling stories. Ones that may leave you intrigued or sleeping with the light on tonight. I'm sitting up in bed. It's nearly 2 a.m. and the house is too quiet. Even with my dog Ace sleeping at the foot of my bed and a gun on the nightstand, I feel vulnerable. What better time to write my story? And it's taken me long enough to put these words on paper. This took place on a clear, crisp autumn day. The exact opposite and rather charming setting for an eerie backwoods story. No purple dusk with silhouetted trees and distant rumbling of thunder to match the ominous tones. But that's the beauty of it. We were at ease, preoccupied and, unbeknownst to us, extremely vulnerable. We had let our guard down. My hiking companion Blake led the way into the woods, following another forgotten trail overgrown with wild grasses and leaf litter. Occasionally, the trail would become obvious, carving its way through an aspen grove, and then disappear again where the spindly roots of an aggressive pine emerged from the soil. On a side hill, about halfway up the mountain, I began to feel a bit ill. Ace was just ahead on the path, trotting alongside Blake. I carried on with mild stomach pain, dizziness, and a slight nosebleed. It wasn't my best day in the back country, but my condition certainly wasn't debilitating. More of an annoyance, really. A steady wind blew that afternoon, and when the wind blows, it can be very hard to hear your hiking companion. Blake continued on, oblivious to my condition and the ever-widening gap between us. I could have collapsed, tumbled down slope, and crashed into a tree that accidentally discharged my sidearm, and Blake would have heard nothing but the fall foliage stirring overhead. Ace knew I was lagging behind, but, well, Blake was the one with the dog biscuits. As I watched Blake and Ace disappear into the trees, I heard a sound coming from the woods across the way. The pines in that area are a deep dark green and grow tightly together. One could easily step from the sunlit meadow and be swallowed by the shade of the forest. No matter how hard you tried to see them, if they didn't move, you'd never know they were there, watching. I stopped and listened for a while, but dismissed the odd sound for being branches bending and popping in the wind. I find it funny now that despite all the things I've experienced, myself and family overall, that I would actually settle for such a thing, blaming it on the wind. There's a term called sounding a tree, and working for the Forest Service, you'll likely cut down a tree at least once in your career. After selecting the tree you wish to drop, you sound it. This is done by taking the blunt end of an axe and knocking the trunk of a tree. If it sounds spongy or hollow, the tree is likely rotten and far more hazardous to drop, so you want a good knock before you do. And the good knock was the sound I heard coming from the woods. Not necessarily an unusual event, but typically the sound of chainsaws would follow shortly thereafter. However, it was very quiet in this area of the forest, only sound being the wind blowing down from the crest of the ridge to the valley below. Again, the wind. I've heard trees creak and groan as their tight grain resists the pressure of a stiff breeze. It's quite unsettling, really, standing at the base of these mammoth pines as they sway, wondering how far they can bend before they break. So, why did this particular knocking make me listen more intently? Because it didn't sound natural. It was 3 successive, rhythmic knocks. I caught up to Blake and told her what I'd heard. She said it might have been a tree branch. so we carried on without giving it much more thought. After climbing another quarter-mile or so, we stepped into the largest aspen grove I have ever seen. We've lived in and among aspens in different states and at different elevations, but never before had we seen them grow to such impressive height and diameter. There are other aspen in the immediate area, but they pale in comparison. The distinct white bark and yellow leaves were beautifully contrasted against a deep blue sky. When we topped the ridge, we were met with what surmised to be a hunter's camp. A large rock had been used as a wind block for campfires, and chairs were made from tree trunks. The logs were ripped down the middle and notched at one end, so the two halves served as an interlocking seat and back support. We were impressed by this primitive engineering. Hanging in a nearby tree was a small cache of food. A minimalist tent site was at its base. The look of concern was evident across our faces. No one had entered the forest from our side, and the other access points meant miles of forested travel. We started looking around the area for other signs that would indicate whether the owner of this humble site intended to return. Were they missing? Was their gear weathered? Did we need to alert fish and game? We weren't alarmed, just cautious, and so decided to break in this site for a while to get a better feel for the situation. I set up my camera on a rock and began filming the aspens. The first 2 videos were only about 12 seconds, because each time I hit record, Blake would inevitably have a comment. She's a woman of few words, until I want the sounds of nature and not commentary. It wasn't long until a hunter was walking the ridge towards us. He startled me at first, standing there in faded camouflage with a crossbow over his shoulder and a .45 strapped to his chest. An older man, wiry, with taut muscles and a keen, observant eye. As he set his gear down and took a seat in one of the aspen chairs, he asked if we had come up from Arizona. I hesitated before answering, no, and then realized he must have read my t-shirt advertising a local coffee shop in Old Town Cave Creek. The advertisement isn't that obvious, and he no more than glanced in my direction before setting down his pack and bow. Did he see that I had a weapon too? "I'm Dane," he said, and extended a strong, calloused hand that had spent a lifetime in the sun. Dane, who runs a veterinarian wild horse rescue operation in Wyoming, was a talker, but an interesting one. And truth be known, I prefer to let strangers talk while I listen. The more they speak, the easier it is to develop a sense of who they are. Your understanding of them grows, while they still know nothing about you. As Dane talked, and Ace pawed at a patch of sooty dirt, I started making coffee. Dane told us about a bull elk he had been tracking. This elk and he were in a territorial standoff. The elk wanted Dane away from his harem, and Dane wanted the elk field-dressed and headed to Wyoming. The way he talked about the light of dawn, the termination snow on distant peaks, and behavior of the elk herd, I knew this man was experienced and a straightforward storyteller. There was an air of humor in the way he spoke of the elusiveness of his intended target, as though the bull were taunting him. But Dane is a patient man, and he's met this challenge 1,000 times in the past. It was just a matter of time, he assured us. And then Dane started to tell a different kind of story. He was more introspective as he considered the details. Not one to easily scare, but something bothered him about what he wanted to say. So I brought this savvy man of the woods a cup of black coffee, seated myself beside Ace, and listened. Dane sipped his coffee as he described his nighttime experiences in the woods north of Swan Valley. These are his traditional hunting grounds. The woods are scarcely traveled, and the elk are plentiful, if you know where to look. He described this amazing view from the uppermost ridge, but explained that it was about another hour hike cross-country. We expressed some concern as to whether Ace could continue on. He had only moved from his cool stirred dirt when offered a small piece of jerky, only to return to his spot, spin twice, and drop to the ground with a heavy sigh. Dane said a big bull elk could be heard in the dark morning hours, heavily crunching through thick undergrowth and bugling for his cows in a nearby field. The bull was agitated by Dane's presence, evidenced by his pacing along the camp perimeter, always close, but not close enough to be taken down by bow and arrow.
"A couple of nights ago," Dane continued, "I didn't hear the elk. In fact, I didn't hear much of anything."
Dane said he'd bedded down early. His day had been long and he'd returned to camp without his winter's meat supply. He built a small fire, boiled water, and added it to his dehydrated meal. He was tired of dehydrated food and was looking forward to getting back to Wyoming, where his family and a hot meal awaited him.
Once I had my after-dinner smoke, I dozed off with my back against a tree. The night grew cold, and I woke up hours later.
He explained he wasn't sure at the time, but his inner clock told him it had to be well after midnight. He rolled out his sleeping bag beneath the one-man tarpaulin and started to unlace his boots when suddenly, instinctively, he knew he was being watched. Still seated, Dane turned to his side and stared hard into the darkness. A sliver of moon provided just enough light for him to make out any subtle movements among the aspen. Dane clicked on his flashlight and scanned the trees with a small disk of pale yellow light. Nothing moved initially, but then, out of the corner of his eye, Dane saw a mass, darker than the night around it, and it moved a little closer. He spun the flashlight beam around, illuminating 3 pairs of eyes staring directly at him. He reasoned as to whether this was the cow herd the bull elk had been protecting, but the height of the eyes was difficult to judge. Being a hunter, Dane remained silent. People are meant to be quiet in the woods, either out of respect for your surroundings, or for those times when you may have unknowingly become prey. Remain concealed with a finger just outside the trigger guard. Waving his flashlight beam across the shadows would have been enough of a disturbance for the cow elk to have gotten up and lumbered to another sleeping location. But the reflective eyes remained fixed, unblinking, and seemed to be assessing Dane's vulnerability. It was a standoff, a test of will. Eventually, the reflective eyes dropped from the light, and the dark masses slowly retreated into the forest. For a man who has spent his life in the backcountry, it was obvious that this was an intimidating experience for him. After a brief moment of thoughtfulness, Dane shrugged and shook his head.
"Not sure what it was," he said, "but I'm glad they decided to move on that night."
With our bodies warmed by coffee, and our contemplative minds energized by a story worth further consideration, Blake and I parted ways with Dane. As we walked the narrow, overgrown trail back to the trailhead, we found what may have been wolf scat. I thought about the possibility of Dane's night visitors being a wolf pack, but then, as if on cue, I heard that inexplicable sound again, closer this time, and not far behind.